Let's have a look at the M3 chip inside the 14-inch MacBook Pro and by extension the iMac and see if this chip is Pro workflow worthy and how much of a generational improvement we are going to get. There's a lot of information to cover, so let's find out. This is Artist Right. Before we do that, a big thank you and welcome to those of you who have already subscribed. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. I'll be releasing more videos in the next coming days and you don't want to miss those. One thing that all of you can definitely help me with is to hit on that like button. This way YouTube algorithm will push this video to an even larger audience. As usual, there'll be lots of information. I highly encourage that you pause the video so you can analyze the result yourself in addition to the analysis I'll be sharing with you. And timestamp will be in the description if you want to jump ahead if I remember to do that. If not, it will come at a later date. If you find the information that I am sharing with you helpful, I'll leave a link to my tip jar in the description. You can help support the channel that way. YouTube Super Thanks also works, or I'm also trying the new YouTube membership and you can just simply tap on the join button. It's just 99 cents per month. You can cancel it anytime. It is something new that I'm trying out, so if you want to contribute that way, you can, and you will get priority replies on the comments and questions that you ask. All right, I want to provide us with a quick update on the previous videos that I made on the M3 Pro and M3 Max. So a few of our astute viewers have pointed out that the M2 Ultra is a 2460 and not a 4060. And my apologies for that. I put down the wrong number. Either that or I'm testing a secret chip from Apple that I am not disclosing. I'll have you figure that one out. But anyway, yeah, so the right number is 2460. I'm not going to pull those videos down to correct that, but I have already pinned a comment at the very top and I put that in the description as well, so my apology for that. I also received a comment saying that the percentage numbers that I'm sharing are depressing. Well, I also qualify them with the word approximately or up to or close to. So these are all approximate values at the best. I mean, that's all I really can tell you. I'm not saying that these are the exact numbers and these are the exact percentage. That's not my intention at all. My intention is to give you the overall picture of how all of these machines work or how these chip works with all the Pro Photo app. And the last thing, if you haven't figured this out yet, I am literally a one-person team. So I am testing all these machines by myself. I am aggregating all the data, putting together this keynote, filming this, and also editing this, and also doing the back end. It is a lot of work. So the fact that I'm able to put all these together, I think this is fantastic, and information that you are getting is really good. And I'll also say that I'm also human, so I am bound to make a mistake. Like most of you out there who are watching this, you're human too, and we do make mistakes from time to time. So I'm just gonna say that. All right, let's talk about the M3. So for this, there are three machines that we're looking at. Two of them are the 13-inch MacBook Pro, that would be the M1 and M2, and the 14-inch one is the M3. Now, interestingly enough, this is one of the most even-keeled test systems that I have, and all of them are all CTO, so they are custom configured, because one of the things I'll tell you right now is that when it comes to these regular consumer-oriented SoC, I am no longer going to be testing the 8GB model because I genuinely not believe 8GB qualifies for any type of Pro workflow. If you're looking at these, definitely upgrade the RAM in the system or buy a system that has more RAM in it already. So that would be my first recommendation there. All right, all of these have 8 CPU cores and they all have the same distribution for performance, for efficiency. Now, the great thing about this is we can then see a clear generational improvement on the chip architecture side of things, which is awesome. As far as GPU goes, M1 has 8, M2 has 10, and M3 has 10. So we have about the same amount of GPUs, and you're going to see also some results that are going to be somewhat of an anomaly. So there's a lot of things we're going to be looking at here. 16 gigabytes of memory across all the models. The only difference in the SSD would be the first one that has the 1 terabyte SSD. Second gen, this one on the 512 gigabyte is still, I believe, like the slower SSD, or at least slower than the 1 terabyte one, but we're going to take a look at that too. All right, a couple of thoughts I have about this going in, and I want to share this right now, is that if we compare the 14-inch MacBook Pro with the M3 versus the M3 Pro, and we update this machine to 16 gigabytes of memory already, we are pretty much within $200 of a M3 Pro machine. And I would argue that M3 Pro machine is a much better option and a much better buy. And if you can really stretch that, I would probably recommend going for this configuration instead, because it is a much better all-around machine compared to just the M3. The other thing I also want to point out is that the moment you bump this up to 24 gigabytes of memory, you are pretty much teetering on the price tag of an M3 Pro already. Granted, a little bit less memory, but an overall better all-around chip. All right. A few extra that you get when you go to the M3 Pro is that you get to drive 2 external displays compared to 1 because the total display in the system. I made a video about this. I'll probably make a separate video just talking about displays on the M series chip, but that's something that will come later on. You get 1 extra Thunderbolt port. You get 2 extra gigabytes of RAM if you configure this to like 16 gigabyte, as I mentioned, that is within a $200 striking distance of the M3 Pro. And that would be 200, not the scribble that I made incorrectly. There we go, 200. And you also get the chip improvement where the M3 has 8 cores, the M3 Pro has 11, 5 performance versus 4 performance, and 6 efficiency versus 4 efficiency. So you get more of that and also 4 more GPU cores. This really adds up to a much better overall machine, but you're going to see some of the results that I'm going to be sharing as well. Now, I'm not going to be testing any iMac in this cycle. However, what I am going to tell you is that this result that you're seeing right now, the performance between this machine and iMac are going to be very similar to each other. So if you wonder how the iMacs are going to perform, I would definitely watch this video and that will give you the answer to that too. Here are some additional test systems that I have. In fact, I just released a video for the M3 Max generation comparing with all these three. I'll leave a link to that in the description. You can check that out. The M3 Pro generation comparing with the rest, links will be in the description as well. And also one thing that I want to address about this briefly is the memory bandwidth. So you may have noticed that between the M1, M2 Pro generation and the M3 Pro, there is a reduction in memory bandwidth. Now, this may look like a step back per se, but it's really not quite that. It's really just the fact that Apple have now realized like, hey, we really over-engineered these chips, and a lot of the applications that are on the market today are not even getting anywhere close to saturating all this bandwidth, because you have to go in and utilize a CPU, GPU, NPU, and a lot of memory and saturate all of those at once in order for you to be able to really saturate that bandwidth. We're really not quite there, and none of the apps that we're using doesn't even come close to probably using like half of those memory bandwidth to start out with. All right, additional test reference system, we have the Max Studio M1 Ultra and also the M2 Ultra, and we also have a surprise Razer that I'm throwing in results for the appropriate tests that can be run as well. And I also received comments about this saying like, be careful about this because the Razer is slower, but there's, are some tasks where this is really outperforming everything. Well, all the ones that I'm testing right now, it doesn't really outperform much. So that's the result that I have. There's definitely more videos coming, so make sure you subscribe to the channel for that. All right, this is a huge leap for any Intel Mac users. So regardless of what you choose, if you're coming from an Intel Mac and you just decide to go with just the regular M1, M2, or M3, you're going to get a performance bump and improvement. It may not be what you desire, and that may be one of those things where you have to upgrade to a higher tier SoC, but it is going to be a huge performance improvement. And I'm going to put it this way. The Mac Mini M1 with 16 gigabytes of memory is really giving a $12,000 Mac Pro with the Xenon chip, that is a 12-core Intel Xenon from 2019, a run for the money when it was released initially. And that machine is pretty much like 10 times cheaper than the Mac Pro. So something to think about there. All right. So some of you have asked me about the Thunderbolt ports on this machine. This would be the Thunderbolt USB ports on the left side of the machine. The answer to that is both of them are running on a separate bus. This means that when you plug something in, you're going to get the full speed. If you plug in something on both of those, they are running on a separate circuitry and you're going to get full speed. So that's a good thing. One thing to note is that I have retested everything on a clean install OS. So this was not an update from the previous generation or anything like that. It is Sonoma 14.1, and on these newer machines, it's Sonoma 14.1.1. A couple of observations I have about this is that in my testing, I have been monitoring the way how the chip is performed. None of them are really throttling in the performance regarding like the M3 generation chip. All of my computers came with Sonoma already installed, none of them with Ventura, unlike some of the speculation or observation that has been happening online. And one thing I say about this generation is that the fan tends to kick on and run louder than the previous generation. And this is why I call this the fansamble, because when I have a few machines in front of me and testing it all together, you do hear that roaring fan sound coming on. All right, from the previous generation, we are getting a lot of things. For example, we're getting the MagSafe 3, we're getting SD card reader, we are getting also an HDMI built into the machine. We're also getting the XDR display, or the Liquid Retina XDR, that is pretty much a high dynamic range display, which is really just an awesome pro level display inside this machine. And now this machine is really worthy of being called a MacBook Pro, despite just having the M3 chip. So it's not an M3 Pro chip. Some people took, I would say, a little having some issues with this, but you know what? It is what it is. All right. The other thing that we do get from this generation is the base SSD that has been bumped up from 256 to 512. A good thing there. There is no space black. However, the starting memory is still at 8 gigabytes, which, like what I said, it's not enough for a pro workflow. It's not even anywhere near, and I would not even recommend that you do that. So that would be the thing. So it has a pro display, like I already mentioned. The max brightness of this display in SDR, standard dynamic range, is 600 nits. I did measure this, and I also ran the calibration on these displays using Calibrite Profiler and the new Calibrite HL devices. It was able to calibrate just fine, and this applies to all M3 variants, M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max. In fact, all of these variants are also compatible with BenQ Palette Master Ultimate, so you can do hardware calibration without any issues. All right. One thing that I want to point out every time I test these regular SoC is that there are segmentation in this. These M1, M2, M3s are generally more consumer oriented, meaning that they're going to be great for any type of general consumer use. But when we start to apply pro workflow to them, they're going to work well in some tasks, but in some, they're going to fall short, as you're going to see in some of the tests I'm doing. And if you are a pro doing this day in, day out, my recommendation is to get a chip and pay a little bit more with the Pro, the Max, or the Ultra moniker, because you are going to get a much better all-around experience from these SoC. Rather than just it being good at one thing but not so good at the other one, you want a good all-around chip that you can use on a daily basis. This is going to be a pro photography review, and all the testing that I'm doing are based on single app because I want to see how the silicon is performing one generation to the next. And also I want to see on the previous generation silicon, how's the current app in the OS really running on it? Is it slowing down the process, which is something that I have been noting a lot. Now, I know that we all multitask in our daily workflow, so the only thing I'm going to tell you is to get more RAM in your system. As far as test configuration go, for these particular consumer-oriented SoC, I'm going to be testing the 16 gigabyte model custom built, and that's all I'm going to do. I can't test every single configuration. However, one thing that we can definitely do is extrapolate the data, and we are in the 3rd generation of these SoC already. So the effect of SSD and RAM in the system is already known at this point. And I always point this out in my chart as well, whether this is a CPU, GPU, or a RAM-based task, and you will get the idea really quickly as far as if you increase those components, will you see a performance improvement or not? This is how you're going to read the chart, and I'll leave a timestamp back to this cheat sheet as well. And if I make any errors on these codings for the spec of the machine, I'll leave it as a pinned post. This way you are aware of this. All right, SSD on these machines. The moment you have configured this, the internal storage on your machine is pretty much fixed. You can't really go in and upgrade it. The only way to really do it is to sell off your machine or trade it in and get a new one. Now, the caveat to this is I have received comments that some have been able to like solder the chip and so forth, but that requires micro soldering and a lot of knowledge. It's not something that you and me can easily pop the back of our machine and do. And when you do that, it definitely voids the warranty. So definitely think about that. When you take the Apple, they're not going to really do that much at all to really help you if you have done that to your machine. And the other thing about the SSD is that the internal storage may be fixed. However, you can always plug in an external drive. That could be a spinning hard drive, a SSD, NAS, or DAS, or any other storage device you may have to expand the storage on the inside. So when you configure SSD, don't think too much about, I want to get more SSD to get a higher speed. Just configure it based on what you need now and also in the future, because the speed, as you're going to see in a lot of these tests, they're not really that relevant at all, even when you even consider multitasking in there, because multitasking, unless you're actively using the RAM on the system that's already exceeding what's already there, if it's not the compressed memory, is using the active memory, then yeah, it will slow down, but that would be a very specific circumstance. And if you're using your machine that hard to start out with, you probably should upgrade your machine with more RAM or get a higher tier SoC and upgrade the components in it. All right. Here's how the speed compared to the rest of the machine. And I'm going to say that in this cycle, the speed is pretty much sustaining what we have seen before. And 3,000 megabytes per second is more than mighty enough fast for any type of workflow for that matter. So asset, images, videos stored internally versus externally, is there any difference? And I have done extensive testing on this. In fact, I have videos with chart explaining all this together. I'll leave a link to this in the description. I highly recommend you check that out. But the short answer to it is no. You're not really going to see that much difference at all. So if you are going to upgrade the internal storage, hoping that you're going to see more performance out of apps you're running on a daily basis, the apps I'm testing in this review, you're not going to see any difference whatsoever. All right, when it comes to memory, You need to consider your use case and modality. If you're like me, you're crazy, you have too many tabs open, you have multiple browsers running, you run too many apps at any given time, definitely get more RAM for your system, because this is something that it's going to benefit you in the long run and is going to help keep the speed and the performance of the machine up. Remember that this is not upgradable, and unlike the SSD, you cannot plug in extra RAM on your system. You are pretty much just stuck with what you got. So think about this really carefully. One thing that you can do if you are a Creative Pro, and especially if you're on a Mac already, is to restart your system. And the first thing you do is launch Activity Monitor, go to the Memory tab, and take a look at the memory pressure. In fact, you can tile the windows in a way that you can really just see the memory pressure as you're launching all your Pro apps. If you're in the green, you're good to go. If you're in the yellow, you might want to think about getting more memory in your next machine. If you're in the red, definitely get more memory on your system. So that would be one way to look at it. The other thing that you can do as well is to download an app such as iStatMenu to keep track of this for up to 30 days. I'll leave a link to this in the description. I use this app all the time. Now, one advice I have if you are coming from the Intel machine is to pretty much configure the RAM, the equivalent to what you have on the Intel machine. Don't go down because you think this is a unified memory. The one thing I'm going to tell you is that it is fast, and it is also shared between the CPU and GPU. And unlike the misconception that some have been thinking that these are a different memory architecture, less is more. Less is not more, less is less on this. So whatever you have on your Intel machine, configure it the same, if not more. This way you can maintain the same performance and not get any type of slowdown or running out of memory. Now for Pro, I recommend to get 32 gigabytes of memory, and part of the reason why is because the moment you start launching Lightroom Classic or any Pro photo editing app, the memory is going to start to really just get eaten up away. Remember too that the operating system also needs memory for it to run and compute tasks in the background. So it's not just only your apps. So when you, for instance, get 16 gigabyte, not all of that 16 is available to your apps. Maybe about 60% of it would be available, but the operating system is also using memory as well. The other thing about these machines that I also want to point out is that you can upgrade them to 16 and the max is 24. And this is also kind of hinting to the fact that I don't believe that these are Pro capable machines in an all-around aspect. However, if you want to really bump that up, you can. But as I said before, if you've gone with 24 gigabytes of memory, that is the price of an M3 Pro, and you're probably better off with that machine. Lightroom Classic 13.0.1, 1000 Nikon DA50 file 1:1 preview in Lightroom. We are getting that slope and seeing an improvement. So comparing the M1 to the M3, we are getting close to about 30%, not exact number. So if that makes you depressed, my apologies for that. But anyway, we're getting about that much improvement in this, and you can see that the M3 is definitely faster than the M2 generation as well. Not quite that number that we're seeing in the M1, but this is still a really good thing to see. How does this compare to the rest? Well, here it is, the M3 chip that we're looking at right now, and you can see where it is clustering at the moment. It is pretty much right there at the bottom Pro machine. And that's really good to see, because this is telling us a couple things that, hey, you know what? This machine is now starting to play in the Pro League. But we're going to see if this machine can sustain in the Pro League chip compared to, for instance, the M1 Pro throughout all the tasks or not, or is it only in some of the tasks? All right, interestingly enough, on my M2 machine, this task decided to take much longer. And no, this data is not incorrectly put in. This is pretty much put in where it is. And I was actually surprised. In fact, I ran this test twice, and we're getting about very similar numbers. So something is definitely going on there with M2. One of the things that I have observed as well is that with the M2 generation, it's not going in and saturating all the cores. For example, the efficiency cores aren't being used at all, only the performance cores for some weird reason. Anyway, this is the result we're getting. How does this compare to the rest? So this is pretty much the M3 chip, and you can see that it is trailing a little bit behind the Pro, but it's clustering right more into that group rather than the previous M1 and M2 that have come before it. That's really a great thing to see, because you are now reducing the time that you have to do any type of workflow. Lightroom Classic HDR Merge 9 Nikon D810 file. How does this perform? Interestingly enough, the M3 is clustering right at the top, very similar to the other machines in the lineup. Now, it's just a touch slower. This is a CPU-based task, but it is grouping right up there with all the new M3 generations, where all the other ones are performing slightly slower than that. Now, this is just 1 second apart. Is that really that big of a difference? No, but it's also showing us as well that this generation silicon is just a touch faster on just those very singular CPU tasks than what have come before. Lightroom Classic Panorama Merge. This is creating a 314 megapixel DNG from 14 Nikon D810. Let's take a look at the timing. So 16 gigabytes on all of these machines. This is a RAM and CPU based task. This is really denoting that the CPU is running faster on these machines and we are getting better performance. You can see that it's about close to 30 seconds faster on these tests. Now M1 and M2 performing the same, and let's see where the M3 is showing up. So it is again clustering in right where the Pro machines are. This is something good to see. I'm glad to see that this result is quite there. Interestingly enough, for example, the M3 Pro machine, this one took much longer to do, even though it has 18 gigabytes of memory. Something is really going on with the M3 Pro generation that I can't really explain, but it's not really performing that well at all. You can take a look at a video to find out more. Lightroom Classic AI Noise Reduction. This is Nikon D810 file, and this is supposed to be a task that is going to be running on the NPU, the Neural Processing Engine, but as of now, there are still issues with NPU that causes artifacting, color shifting. That's why it's not being used, and the GPU is being used at this point. So when we take a look at this, comparing the M1, M2, and M3, the M2 is faster. However, the M3, it's not that much faster than the M2. The number of cores are very similar. It's just slightly faster, but not by much. And the M1 does have the advantage of having 2 less GPU core in the system. How does this cluster in with the rest? Well, this is pretty much the M3 right there. And as you can see, these are pretty much all right there at the bottom of the chart. So it's not really clustering in with the Pro machine just yet. And this is where the maximum amount of physical cores on the system, whether it is CPU or GPU, is really limiting the chip. So again, it's good in many tasks, but it's not a good all around, and it's not quite as good as the Pro or the Max chip. So that's something to think about when you are configuring your machine for Pro workflow. Lightroom 7, the reason why I'm showing this is because many of us may not be using Lightroom CC. However, with this, the export engine is using CPU, GPU, and RAM all in combination, and you get some impressive time on this. And there are times when Lightroom Classic do export faster and they go and revamp the engine, but most of the time they don't. And what we get is Lightroom CC that's running these export tasks and really utilizing all the resource on the system. And that's why I'm including this. So we're seeing a steep return there. And this is, again, a really good number, approximately maybe 30 to 40% faster than the M1 generation. There we go. We're getting into a range of percentage now. But this is also still a really good number to see, especially compared to the M2. It's a marginal improvement over the M2, but it's still nonetheless something that's really great for us to have, especially if you're just jumping in this machine. Here's where the M3 is pretty much clustering in, and you can see that this is pretty much clustering close to where the Pro machines are. This is something good to see. Like I said, this is really trying to be a Pro machine, but as we're starting to see already, in some of the tasks, it is limited by the amount of cores that are on the system, whether it's CPU or GPU, and it's not the best all around. What about in Capture One 23 version 16.3.0.76? I really want to do that in binary. I might do that for my next video. Anyway, Capture One import. So we are seeing time improvement. This is just literally using the CPU on the system and it's not even maxing it out. I would say that this is a good indicator of CPU performance, but I would not be correct in saying that. But we are seeing a performance improvement when we cap pretty much all the 8 cores. So with this 8 cores, what we're really seeing is that there is a frequency improvement, there is an efficiency improvement, which results in these times that are lower, but nonetheless, this is nowhere near as impressive as I want to be because it's Capture One, not because of the chip. All right. So where does the M3 come into this equation? Well, this is pretty much where the number sits. And if you can take a look at this right now, this is pretty much clustering in very interestingly. In fact, it's pretty much right where the M1 Ultra is. And this is what I was saying, that Capture One does not go in and utilize a resource on the system well, because I have a machine with even, for instance, 24 core CPU, and is still not performing that much better than the one with 16 or the one with like 20. So we're not really seeing this program scale really well, but I just want to point it out. All right, how about export? This is pretty much just using GPU and GPU exclusively. 2 less cores, M2 and M3 pretty much have the same amount of cores on the system. And we're seeing that these cores does show a slight performance improvement. But at the very most, when you have a program like this that's really going in and maximizing this, it's just really showing a marginal improvement of 2 minutes and 20 seconds. I wouldn't say this is a big deal at all. And if you're running Capture One, I would argue that the M2 machine, it's a pretty good, compelling option. And this is also some results that I've seen from the M3 Max generation test as well. So something interesting to note there. Capture One export, where do these machine cluster in? Well, pretty much it's a little bit closer to the Pro, as you can see there, but for the most part, the timing is kind of somewhat in between. Faster than the M1 and M2, but not really quite there where the Pro machine is. And this is where, like I said, the number of GPU cores is a limitation. However, like I said, with Capture One, there is a point of diminishing return when it comes to the amount of GPU cores on the system. So giving it more doesn't necessarily always mean it's going to scale well and be exponentially fast. All right, Photoshop. For now, I am using Digital Lloyd Chamber Test. Link to his website will be in the description. I have a commercial license for a Puget system. However, they are still in beta for Apple Silicon right now, and I want to wait until the later beta or the full version first so that the benchmark numbers would remain a little bit more consistent and can be more of a generational test. So these are the benchmark I'm doing, and let's take a look at some of the time. So with this Photoshop speed test with 70 and 90% memory, we can see that this M3 is pretty much clustering right at the top, where all the previous generation machine are now taking a little bit longer to run based on the newer OS and the current software. This M3 is pretty much sticking with the crowd at the very top there. Slightly slower by half a second, but it's not that big of a deal. But this is also showing us that there is a CPU speed and efficiency improvement in the M3 generation compared to the one that have come before as well. What about Photoshop Medium, 15.7 gigabyte file? Now, something to think about this is that if you have 16 gigabytes of memory on your system, this file will almost fill that memory already. And remember that that memory in your system still needs a certain amount to run the operating system. So when you factor all those in together, this is definitely going into the paging or the swapping on the system. So 70% at 90%. Interestingly enough, when we start to work with large files, the M3 didn't really do really well. It performed pretty much dead last on the 70%. However, once we bumped this up to 90%, it actually did perform a lot better. Now, is this a result of SSD being slower? It could be, but I mean, you saw the result from SSD tests before. The speed of this generation is about the same, if not faster or slightly faster than the previous generation. So this is not really a factor there. I think with the 70%, there's some other anomaly going on that is causing this problem, because when we bump this up to 90% usage, that is pretty much almost the full utilization of it. And the swapping file, it actually is performing much better. Something to think about there. So Photoshop Huge, 56 gigabyte. Simply put it this way. If you are Bert Monroy, you would definitely work with these large type of files. But if for majority of us, we're not really going to be working with this. And if we work with these type of large files every now and then, you can see the time scale is really not that bad at all. But what is interesting the most to me is the fact that two factors really come into play a role. Number one, the amount of memory in the system, and also the SSD size, and by extension, somewhat speed as well, because technically in the 1 terabyte, it's supposed to be a slightly faster SSD, but it's really not. But nonetheless, we see this is pretty much like about a minute apart. So in the M3 generation, it's not really doing that well at all with these large files. Again, not an overall winner, as we can see, and it doesn't technically cluster up with all the Pro machines that we wanted to see. So this is SSD speed I'm showing you right now. It's pretty much performing right about the same as the previous generation that have come before, but the result is pretty drastic when we take a look at these charts. So something to think about there. We can't really just blame SSD on this one. Like I said, there is probably some other anomaly going on as well, because all these factors are about the same, but what contributes to this machine being close to a minute faster compared to these two? And one of them is a newer generation machine that's not doing too well. All right. Final Cut Pro 10.6.10 encoder decoder engine. And some of you are asking, like, how does the clip perform in the timeline? I mean, with my clip, 8-bit 420 4K, it performs just fine. I don't have a stringent need for like editing, so for what I do is fine. I hear from people all the time that I do A, B, C, and D, and this pretty much slows down to a halt, even on the expensive Ultra machine, and that's not my workflow. It's really hard for me to test that when I don't use those on a daily basis. But for what I can do. I can scrub and do everything just fine. So H.264, one of the things that we're going to see right now is that this machine M3 is pretty much clustering in with the rest, so the encoder decoder engine on this is not that much faster. One thing that I've pointed out in other videos, I'm also going to point this out here too, is that the M1 Ultra, we are now seeing the export time improvement on the H.264 and all the other tasks as well, but it actually took Apple until 10.6.10 to have that type of improvement. And by the way, this is after the M2 Ultra has already been released as well. So HEVC 8-bit, H.265, the M3 is clustering right in at the top, but it's pretty much right there within the same group as the rest of the machine, because if you take a look at the spec for these, the encoder decoder engine are pretty much exactly the same on those. What about when it comes to ProRes Pro 2.2? Let's take out the Razer machine, and if we take a look right now, the M1 and M2 are performing slower because in these machines, there is no ProRes encoder decoder engine. Now, in this generation, Apple did add that in, but it is still trailing behind the Pro machine. However, it is clustering in right closer to the Pro and the Max machine on this. So something interesting to note there. Adobe After Effects benchmark. And this is pretty much just using Adobe benchmark. So for this, we're seeing the timing improving on these, and this is a task that uses CPU and also GPU in combination, because I have gone in and enabled the Mercury hardware acceleration engine on this, and we're seeing the improvement in time. Now, is this like a huge drastic improvement? No, it's an incremental improvement over what we have before. One thing that I do want to point out is that between just the CPU and the CPU alone will take just slightly longer. However, when you use just a CPU for export, you're not going to get color artifacting, you're not going to get banding or posterization that happens. When you use a GPU, that is something that happens. That's why it's not enabled by default. However, what I'm doing here and sharing the result in our test is the one that is using the hardware acceleration. So where does the M3 perform in this? So it's pretty much right there. It's really trying to be up there with the Pro group, but it's really not quite there yet. However, it is still pulling ahead of the M2 and M1 generation have come before it. So some great things happening there, but definitely not all around throughout as what we really wanted to see it do. A lot of interesting results there. Analysis, thoughts, and observation. The best way how I can put this is M3 is a previous generation Pro wannabe. In many of those tests that I've showed you, M3 is pretty much clustering in where the Pro chips are. That's something that is good to see, and it's also pulling itself further away from the previous M1 and M2 that have come before. This is telling us that there is better efficiency, the core speed has definitely improved, and if you have an M1 right now, going from the M1 to the M3 is a huge improvement in terms of the SoC performance. You also get a much better laptop chassis as well with the Pro screen, extra ports and so forth, so this is a jump. However, if you're going to make that jump in the first place, I would probably recommend getting the Pro SoC or even higher. This way you get an even higher performance when the price are just so close to each other already. If you're coming from the M2 generation, I would probably say, well, maybe you can really skip this because it is an improvement, but it's marginal as best. It's more of a generation to generational improvement. And in certain instances, you will also see as well, and I pointed out that the M3, even though it is a Pro wannabe, it does come up to a ceiling where it doesn't have any more CPU core, it doesn't have any more GPU core, and it does meet the limitation rather quickly. So those are some of the things that I want to point out, and it's not the best all-around chip for Pro workflow. It will perform well in certain tasks, but for instance, just even take Lightroom Classic. It performs well in many, but not most tasks. Panorama Merge didn't really do well at all. All right. Taking a look at this, one of the things that I have commented on is that if you update the M3 to 16 gigabytes of memory, you are pretty much within a striking distance of the M3 Pro, and you are much better off with an M3 Pro chip. If you update this to 24 gigabytes of memory, you might have more memory in your system, but you are still limited by the silicon that's on there, the amount of cores. So if you're already that close in pricing, I would highly recommend going for the Pro instead, for Pro workflow, and I'm always a big believer in that. One of the things I always want to point out on these videos as well is that we're probably going to be getting these laptops on a yearly release cadence. This means that the app developer has a lot of work to do to contend with an OS update, not to mention the point release throughout the years that has some minor underpinning changes, but every time a major OS update come out, there's a huge underpinning changes. So they have to optimize their app for that and make sure it's compatible. Then we have a new silicon, so they have to optimize their app for these new silicon. And by the time they start to even do any of these work, a new chip, a new OS is already on the horizon. Everyone is playing catch up, including Apple. The best case of this is Final Cut Pro. It took a long time, up to about now, 10.6.10, for the export time to improve in the M1 Ultra. M2 Ultra is already out by this point. M1 Ultra has already been discontinued. Yet in the beginning of the M1 Ultra cycle, and even in the end of the M1 Ultra cycle, we have not seen those export time improve until now. That's all I really have to say about optimization. Even the maker of the machine that has the best vertical integration still falls short in some areas. And when this happens that way to them, imagine how the other developers are. So that's some food for thought there. So should you upgrade? From an Intel machine, I say yes. I gave this analogy already that the Mac Mini M1 16 gigabytes of memory is performing really close to a $12,000 Mac Pro. And yeah, you're gonna see a lot of speed improvement. If you're coming from the Apple M, it just really depends on where you're really coming from, what you're doing. And it may not make the most sense. For example, if you have the M1 machine as a laptop, it may be worthwhile to go to the M3 in the 14-inch MacBook Pro because it's gonna show you a much better improvement. If you have the iMac, I mean, I would probably say look at the Mac Mini with the M2 Pro or the Mac Studio instead and get an external display because that's going to be a much better pro workflow machine than just, for instance, the iMac. That would be my thoughts on all of those. And the other things, if you need to upgrade the components in your machine, then I think that would be a good option to do so. Here's a chart of the recommended SoC for these type of workflow. And if you notice, this starts with the Pro chip. It does not include any of the regular ones at all, but I'm going to share this with you anyway. So good, better, best as you read across for all these different tasks. Now, I have made a comment in the previous video of Photoshop saying that, hey, I might have to relook this again. But technically, I am correct in my resolve when I put this together is that the best chip for Photoshop right now is to go with the M3 and at least with like the Pro. And the reason why is because if you go with the Pro and you upgrade the memory, that is an amazing Photoshop-oriented task machine because the cores are that much faster and you can run tasks that much faster, as we have already seen in the testing result that I have shown here and in my other videos as well. If you're using Capture One, I still think that the Macs are the best one to go with, but not the top Macs. I would definitely just recommend just like the base SoC, and the M2 tends to be the best one at this point. So if you can get the M2 base one, that is definitely something to consider. If you're doing any type of video workflow, well, definitely I would recommend going with either the Max or the Ultra because of the extra encoder decoder engines are in there. And if you want the ultimate performance, any of these chips would do just fine. In fact, I would argue that the M1 Ultra is probably the best value machine out there right now. The price, even on Apple refurbished store, has been coming down quite a bit. And you can still get the M1 Ultra cheaper than the M3 Pro top specs at this point. Granted, yes, it doesn't have a display, you have to bring your own mouse and keyboard, but if you're okay contenting with that and having a desktop machine, you're gonna get an amazing performer because even the latest M3 Max, it comes close to that. But in most of those tasks, it doesn't really exceed the M1 Ultra yet. So some food for thought there. Here's a chart for Upgrader if you want to use that. The best thing that you can do is just to circle yourself on the silicon that you're on. For example, if you're on the M1, you can certainly skip to go to the M3, or you can even go to, for example, the M1 Max. Going either way down a generation, meaning that you're upgrading from a generation, or within the same generation, you're really going for a higher performance, for example, the Pro to Max, you're gonna see improvement anyway. In fact, as price started to come down, you can even go, for example, to the M2 Max or the M2 Pro, and you're definitely still going to see a speed improvement. So there's a lot of upgrade paths to really think about. But if you can see in this chart right now, the ultimate machine at this point in time is the Ultra. And technically on the M2 Max, I forgot to put an arrow there, from the M2 Max to the M1 Ultra, that's also a good option too. Anyway, lots of thoughts to really share here. M3 is a really great improvement specifically on this. So in this generation, I would say the M3 chip and the M3 Max are a huge improvement, something that I really love to see. The M3 Pro is kind of like one of those iffy things right now. A lot of things to really think about. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in art we trust.